The little black girl cried desperately, "I can't eat this anymore, it has ants." But what the lonely millionaire neighbor discovered through his window broke his heart and changed everything forever. A 7-year-old girl's desperate cries echoed through thin apartment walls as she was forced to swallow pasta crawling with ants. Across the street, a lonely millionaire witnessed something that would shatter his heart forever, but no one imagined what would come next. Before you continue, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think will happen next. Your engagement means everything to this channel. Marcus Sterling adjusted his Italian silk tie as he stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office on the 32nd floor. At 32 years old, he commanded a business empire worth over $200 million. Yet tonight, like every night for the past 3 years, he felt utterly alone. The city sparkled below him like scattered diamonds, each light representing lives filled with connection, laughter and love, everything that seemed to elude him despite his immense wealth. His Rolex Daytona ticked softly in the silence as he loosened his tie, the weight of another successful but emotionally empty day settling on his broad shoulders. Marcus had built Sterling Enterprises from the ground up after his parents died in a car accident when he was 25, channeling his grief into an unstoppable drive for financial success. But success, he'd learned, was a cold companion in the dark hours of the night. The penthouse apartment felt more like a museum than a home, with its pristine white walls, minimalist furniture, and abstract art that cost more than most people earned in a year. Every surface gleamed under carefully positioned LED lighting, yet no amount of luxury could fill the hollowness that had consumed him since he'd lost the only people who'd ever truly loved him unconditionally. Marcus walked to his home bar, masterpiece of black marble and gold fixtures, and poured himself 2 fingers of 25-year-old Macallan. The whiskey burned pleasantly as it went down, but it couldn't burn away the loneliness that had become his constant companion. He'd tried dating, of course, beautiful women who were attracted to his wealth, his power, his commanding presence. But every relationship felt hollow, transactional, devoid of the genuine connection his soul craved. The sound of his phone buzzing interrupted his melancholy thoughts. Another business associate, wanting to discuss a merger, another social invitation to an event where he'd be surrounded by people yet feel completely isolated. He ignored it, instead moving to the telescope he'd positioned near the window, not to gaze at stars but to observe the life happening in the apartments across the street, vicariously experiencing the human connections he'd somehow lost the ability to form. Through the powerful lens, he could see into the windows of the modest apartment building that stood in stark contrast to his luxury high-rise. There, families gathered around dinner tables, children played with their parents, couples shared intimate moments. It had become his nightly ritual, this voyeuristic glimpse into authentic human emotion, even if it only deepened his sense of separation from the world. But tonight, as he adjusted the telescope's focus, something different caught his attention. In a third-floor window of the building across the street, he saw a small figure hunched over what appeared to be a kitchen table. As the image sharpened, his breath caught in his throat. It was a little girl, perhaps 7 years old, with beautiful dark skin and delicate features that spoke of both innocence and profound sadness. The child was crying, not the typical tears of a youngster denied a toy or facing bedtime, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone experiencing genuine anguish. Her small shoulders shook with each breath, and even from his distant vantage point, Marcus could see the fear in her posture. She sat rigidly upright, as if afraid to move, her tiny hands trembling as she lifted a fork toward her mouth. Behind her stood a woman Marcus had glimpsed before, tall, angular, with sharp features, and blonde hair pulled back severely. The woman's body language radiated authority and impatience, her arms crossed as she loomed over the child, with an expression of cold determination. Even through the telescope, Marcus could see the woman's lips moving, apparently issuing commands, or threats that kept the little girl frozen in her chair. But it was what the child was being forced to eat that made Marcus's blood run cold. As he fine-tuned the telescope's focus, he could clearly see dark specks moving across the pasta on the girl's plate. His stomach lurched as the horrible reality became clear. The little girl was being forced to eat food that was crawling with ants, insects that swarmed over every strand of spaghetti, every piece of what should have been a nourishing meal. The child lifted another forkful with shaking hands, and Marcus watched in horror as she closed her eyes tight, tears streaming down her cheeks, and forced herself to swallow. The woman behind her nodded with satisfaction, then said something that made the girl's shoulders slump in defeat before she reached for another bite of the contaminated food. Marcus stepped back from the telescope, his own hands trembling now, the whiskey glass slipping from his fingers to shatter on the marble floor. In all his 32 years, through business betrayals, the loss of his parents, and countless personal disappointments, he had never witnessed anything that struck him with such visceral horror. The image of that beautiful child being forced to consume food crawling with insects would be seared into his memory forever. Something primitive and protective awakened in his chest, an emotion he hadn't felt since his parents died, when he'd lost his last connection to unconditional love. This child, this innocent little girl being subjected to unthinkable cruelty, had somehow pierced through the emotional armor he'd built around his heart. The loneliness that had plagued him for years suddenly transformed into something else entirely. A burning need to act, to protect, to fight for someone who couldn't fight for herself. Marcus reached for his phone with steady hands, his mind already racing through possibilities. But as he started to dial 911, he hesitated. What would he tell them? That he'd been watching through a telescope? Would they believe him? Would they act quickly enough? And what would happen to the child if the authorities dismissed his claims, or moved too slowly? The weight of 3 years of isolation, of meaningless success, of emotional numbness, suddenly crystallized into perfect clarity. This moment, witnessing this child's suffering, wasn't just a call to action. It was his chance to finally matter to someone, to channel his resources and determination towards something that truly mattered. For the first time in years, Marcus Sterling felt truly alive. But as he stood there in his pristine penthouse, surrounded by all the trappings of success, he had no idea that saving this child would uncover secrets that would shake the very foundations of everything he thought he knew about justice, family, and the true price of power. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He paced the marble floors of his penthouse until dawn, the image of the little girl's tear-stained face haunting every moment of darkness. By morning, he'd made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find a way to help her, regardless of the consequences. He'd built his empire on calculated risks and strategic thinking, but this felt different. This wasn't about profit margins or market analysis. This was about a child's life, and every instinct he possessed screamed that she was in immediate danger. The memory of those ants crawling across her food, the way she'd forced herself to swallow despite her obvious revulsion, made his chest tight with a rage he hadn't felt since his parents' funeral. At 7 a.m., Marcus stood before his bathroom mirror, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the tension in his jaw that no amount of expensive grooming products could hide. His reflection showed a man who'd spent the night being transformed from a successful but emotionally disconnected businessman into someone with a purpose that transcended personal gain. He dressed carefully in a charcoal grey suit, selecting pieces that would help him blend into the neighborhood across the street without attracting unwanted attention. As he knotted his tie, Marcus realized he didn't even know the child's name, her story, or the full extent of what she was enduring. But he was determined to find out. The apartment building across the street was a study, in contrast to his luxury high-rise. Built sometime in the 1960s, its red brick facade showed wear from decades of weather and neglect, though it maintained the dignity of working-class architecture. As Marcus approached, he noticed details his telescope couldn't capture. The small garden maintained by tenants in the front courtyard, children's chalk drawings on the sidewalk, the worn brass mailboxes that spoke of families who'd called this place home for years. He positioned himself at a coffee shop with a clear view of the building's entrance, ordering an espresso he didn't want while establishing what he hoped would be surveillance that looked casual. Through the window, he watched the ebb and flow of residents, working parents hurrying to catch buses, teenagers reluctantly heading to school, elderly residents walking small dogs. At 8:30, his patience was rewarded. The sharp-featured blonde woman he'd seen through the telescope emerged from the building's main entrance, her movements brisk and purposeful. She wore a navy business suit that suggested professional employment, her hair still pulled back in the same severe style. But it was her expression that made Marcus's jaw clench, the cold satisfaction of someone who wielded power without conscience. More importantly, the little girl was nowhere to be seen. The woman walked alone, checking her phone as she strode toward a bus stop 2 blocks away. Marcus felt a surge of relief mixed with concern. Relief that the child wasn't being dragged along to endure more abuse. Concern about what might be happening to her in that apartment during the woman's absence. For the next 3 hours, Marcus maintained his vigil from the coffee shop, learning the rhythms of the neighborhood while keeping careful watch on apartment 3B. Through his positioned observations, he noticed that no other adults seemed associated with that particular unit. No visitors, no one else coming or going. It appeared to be just the woman and the child, which somehow made the situation feel even more urgent and dangerous. At 11:45, movement in the third-floor window caught his attention. A small face appeared briefly at the glass. The same little girl, but now Marcus could see her more clearly in daylight. She was beautiful, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed far too old for her 7 years. Her hair was styled in neat braids, suggesting someone still cared about her appearance, even as they tormented her with contaminated food. The child pressed her palm against the window, and even from across the street, Marcus could see the longing in her posture. She was looking down at the other children playing in the courtyard, watching their games with the wistful expression of someone who understood she was excluded from such simple joys. After a moment, she disappeared from view. But something about that brief glimpse solidified Marcus's determination. This wasn't a child who was merely being neglected. This was a little girl who was being systematically tormented by someone who should have been protecting her. The casual cruelty of forcing her to eat contaminated food suggested a level of psychological abuse that made his successful businessman's instincts scream with alarm. Marcus pulled out his phone and began making calls, utilizing the extensive network of contacts he'd built over his 7 years in business. First, he called his attorney, James Morrison, a man who specialized in cases that required both discretion and aggressive action. "James, I need information about a child who might be in danger," Marcus said without preamble. "I need to know her legal status, who her guardian is, and whether there have been any reports filed with social services." "Marcus, you're talking about getting involved in a family situation," James replied carefully. "That's complicated territory, especially without clear evidence of abuse. What exactly have you witnessed?" Marcus described the scene from the previous night, his voice tight with controlled anger as he recounted the details. James listened without interruption, his silence growing more thoughtful with each revelation. "If what you're describing is accurate, we're looking at clear child abuse," James finally said. "But approaching this correctly is crucial. One wrong move could make things worse for the child or expose you to legal complications. I'll need to research the family situation carefully before we determine the best course of action." "How long will that take?" Marcus asked, watching the empty window where the child had appeared. "Give me 24 hours. I'll use my contacts at Child Protective Services and see what I can find in public records. In the meantime, document everything you observe, but don't approach the family directly. If this woman is as dangerous as you suspect, we need to be strategic about how we proceed." After ending the call, Marcus felt both relief and frustration. Relief that he'd taken concrete steps to help, frustration that bureaucracy and legal caution might delay action while a child continued to suffer. But he'd spent years learning patience in business negotiations, and he understood that sometimes the most effective action required careful preparation. As he prepared to leave the coffee shop, the apartment building's main door opened again. This time, it was the little girl who emerged, but she wasn't alone. A woman Marcus didn't recognize accompanied her, someone with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor who seemed to genuinely care about the child's welfare. The woman knelt down to the girl's eye level, saying something that made the child nod solemnly before taking her hand. Together, they walked toward what Marcus assumed was the local elementary school, the woman's protective posture suggesting she might be a teacher or counselor rather than a family member. But it was the little girl's behavior that broke Marcus's heart all over again. She walked with the careful precision of a child who'd learned that any misstep might result in punishment, her small shoulders held rigidly, as if she were constantly braced for criticism, or worse. Even her interaction with the kind woman seemed guarded, as if she'd learned not to trust adult attention completely. As they disappeared around the corner, Marcus made a silent promise to that brave little girl walking to school with such dignified composure despite her suffering. Whatever it took, whatever resources he needed to deploy, whatever legal or personal risks he had to accept, he was going to make sure she never had to eat another meal crawling with insects. But first, he needed to understand exactly what kind of monster he was preparing to fight. By evening, Marcus had established what he privately called Operation Guardian Angel, a systematic approach to understanding and ultimately solving the crisis unfolding in apartment 3B. He'd rearranged his schedule, delegating urgent business matters to his most trusted executives while maintaining the appearance of normal operations. His penthouse had been transformed into a command center of sorts, with legal documents, child welfare resources, and surveillance equipment positioned strategically throughout the living room. The telescope remained at the window, but now it was supplemented by a high-powered camera with telephoto capabilities that could capture detailed images if needed for evidence. James Morrison arrived at 6 p.m. with a manila folder that would change everything Marcus thought he knew about the situation. The attorney's expression was grim as he settled into one of Marcus's leather chairs, refusing the offered drink in favor of immediate discussion. "The child's name is Zara Thompson," James began, opening the folder with deliberate care. 7 years old, as you suspected. But Marcus, this case is far more complicated and dangerous than either of us anticipated. Marcus leaned forward, every nerve alert as James continued his briefing. Zara's father, David Thompson, died 8 months ago in what was officially ruled an accidental fall from a construction site where he worked as a project manager. He was 34 years old, had no history of workplace accidents, and according to his co-workers was extremely safety conscious. But here's where it gets interesting and disturbing. James pulled out a legal document, his finger tracing specific paragraphs as he spoke. David Thompson's will left his entire estate to his daughter Zara, to be held in trust until her 18th birthday. We're not talking about small money here, Marcus. David had invested wisely over the years and had a substantial life insurance policy. The trust is worth approximately $1.8 million. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice as the implications became clear. And the woman I saw, the one forcing Zara to eat contaminated food? Helena Morrison. No relation to me, despite the shared surname, James said with distaste. She married David Thompson just 6 months before his death, making her Zara's stepmother and legal guardian. According to the will, Helena receives a modest monthly allowance for Zara's care, but the bulk of the inheritance remains untouchable in the trust. Unless something happens to Zara, Marcus said, the words feeling like poison in his mouth. Exactly. If Zara were to die before reaching 18, the inheritance would pass to her legal guardian, Helena Morrison. We're looking at a woman with a very strong financial motive to harm this child. Marcus stood abruptly, moving to the window where he could see the apartment building across the street. Lights were beginning to flicker on in various windows, families settling in for evening routines that should have represented safety and comfort. But for Zara Thompson, home was a place where her stepmother systematically tormented her, possibly as part of a longer-term plan to claim her inheritance. "There's more," James continued. "I've discovered that Helena Morrison has a history. She was married twice before David Thompson, both times to older men with assets. Her first husband died in a suspicious house fire 2 years into their marriage. Her second husband suffered what appeared to be food poisoning that led to fatal complications. In both cases, she inherited substantial amounts after relatively short marriages. The room seemed to spin around Marcus as the full scope of what they were dealing with became clear. This wasn't simply a case of child abuse or neglect. They were looking at a woman who appeared to be a serial killer, someone who married for money and eliminated obstacles to her financial goals. And 7-year-old Zara Thompson was her next target. How has she avoided investigation? Marcus asked, his business mind trying to understand how such a pattern could go unnoticed. She's careful, patient, and she moves between jurisdictions, James explained. Her first marriage was in Colorado, her second in Arizona, and now she's here in California with David Thompson. Different states, different law enforcement agencies, different investigative protocols. Without someone connecting the dots across multiple jurisdictions, the pattern isn't immediately obvious. Marcus turned back from the window, his expression hardening into the focused determination that had built his business empire. What are our options for getting Zara away from her immediately? James shook his head slowly. That's the problem. Marcus, legal child removal requires substantial evidence of immediate danger, and forcing a child to eat contaminated food, while horrific, might not meet the threshold for emergency intervention. Helena Morrison has been careful not to leave obvious physical evidence, and Zara hasn't reported abuse to school officials or medical professionals. So we just wait for this woman to kill her? Not necessarily. There are other approaches, but they require careful planning and perfect execution. One mistake could alert Helena that she's under scrutiny, which might accelerate her timeline for harming Zara. Marcus moved to his bar not to pour himself a drink, but to think clearly about their next steps. His years in business had taught him that complex problems required multifaceted solutions, and this situation would demand every resource and strategy at his disposal. I want to hire private investigators to document Helena Morrison's every move, he said finally. I want child welfare experts to advise us on building a case for Zara's removal, and I want security specialists to ensure that if Helena Morrison tries to hurt that little girl, we're in a position to intervene immediately. James nodded approvingly. Those are solid first steps, but Marcus, you need to understand what you're committing to. If Helena Morrison is what we suspect she is, a calculating killer who's already murdered at least 2 husbands, then she won't hesitate to eliminate anyone she perceives as a threat to her plans. Are you saying I'm putting myself in danger by helping Zara? I'm saying that a woman who would force a 7-year-old to eat food crawling with ants as psychological torture probably won't respond well to having her inheritance scheme disrupted. Marcus looked across the street at the apartment building, knowing that somewhere in those windows, a little girl was probably facing another night of fear and loneliness. The thought of Zara Thompson lying in bed, wondering if tomorrow would bring more cruelty, more contaminated food, more evidence that the adult world had abandoned her to a monster's care, made his decision simple. Then we'd better make sure we move faster than she does, he said quietly, because I'm not letting that child spend one more day than necessary under the same roof as someone who's planning to kill her. But as Marcus began making plans to save Zara Thompson, neither he nor James Morrison realized that Helena Morrison had already noticed the well-dressed man watching her apartment building from the coffee shop across the street. And she had begun making plans of her own. Don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think Marcus should do next? 3 days into Operation Guardian Angel, Marcus received a call that changed everything. It was Dr. Sarah Chen, the child psychologist he'd hired to consult on Zara's case, and her voice carried an urgency that made his blood run cold. Marcus, I've been reviewing the materials you provided, and I need to meet with you immediately, she said. What I've discovered about this child's situation goes far beyond what we initially discussed. Within an hour, Dr. Chen sat in Marcus's penthouse office, her normally composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled alarm. She was a woman in her mid-40s who'd spent 20 years working with traumatized children, but something about Zara Thompson's case had clearly shaken her professional composure. I've seen cases of systematic psychological abuse before, she began, but what Helena Morrison is doing to this child represents a level of calculated cruelty that suggests she's not just after the inheritance money, she's enjoying the process of breaking Zara's spirit. Dr. Chen opened her tablet, showing Marcus a detailed analysis she'd compiled. The contaminated food is just one element of what appears to be a comprehensive program designed to destroy a child's sense of self-worth and hope. I suspect there are other forms of abuse happening when Zara is alone with Helena: psychological manipulation, isolation tactics, possibly even medical neglect. How can you be certain without direct access to Zara? Marcus asked. Because I've been observing her behavior patterns during her walks to and from school, Dr. Chen replied. The woman who accompanies her, that's Mrs. Rodriguez, a retired teacher who volunteers to help children from troubled homes get to school safely. I spoke with her yesterday. Marcus leaned forward, hanging on every word. Mrs. Rodriguez has been walking with Zara for 2 months, ever since she noticed the child seemed afraid to make the journey alone. According to her observations, Zara exhibits classic signs of complex trauma, hypervigilance, social withdrawal, and what she calls learned helplessness. But here's what's truly heartbreaking, Marcus. Despite everything she's enduring, this little girl has an extraordinary gift. What kind of gift? Dr. Chen pulled up a video on her tablet. Mrs. Rodriguez recorded this with Zara's permission last week. Watch carefully. The video showed Zara sitting on a bench outside the school, and she was singing, not just humming, a childhood melody, but performing a complex piece with the voice of someone far beyond her years. Her tone was pure, powerful, and achingly beautiful, carrying emotions that seemed impossible for a 7-year-old to understand, let alone express. That's Ave Maria, performed in perfect Italian pronunciation, Dr. Chen explained. Mrs. Rodriguez says Zara taught herself by listening to classical music recordings at the library. She has what appears to be perfect pitch and an intuitive understanding of musical composition that music teachers would kill to work with. Marcus watched the video again, mesmerized by the contrast between the child's obviously traumatic home life and the transcendent beauty of her voice. Does Helena know about this talent? That's the terrifying part. Mrs. Rodriguez mentioned that when she praised Zara's singing, the child became frightened and begged her never to mention it at home. Helena Morrison apparently forbids Zara from singing, calling it noise and punishing her when she's caught humming. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. Helena Morrison wasn't just torturing Zara for the inheritance money. She was actively trying to destroy everything beautiful and special about the child, as if her very existence was an offense that needed to be systematically eliminated. Dr. Chen, what's your professional assessment of how much time we have before Helena escalates to more serious harm? The psychologist's expression darkened. Based on the pattern of psychological abuse and the financial motive, I'd estimate we have weeks, not months. Children like Zara often experience a breaking point, where they either completely withdraw from the world or begin acting out in ways that give abusers justification for more severe discipline. Either scenario could provide Helena with opportunities to claim Zara died from accident or illness. Marcus stood and walked to his window, looking across at the apartment building where Zara was enduring another day of systematic cruelty. The weight of responsibility felt crushing. This child's life literally depended on decisions he made in the next few days. His phone rang, interrupting his contemplation. James Morrison's voice carried a tension that immediately put Marcus on alert. Marcus, we have a problem. Helena Morrison has hired a private investigator of her own. My sources indicate she's become suspicious that someone is watching her, and she's taking steps to identify who it is and why. How did she find out? We're not sure, but she's been more careful about her routines, changing her departure times, taking different routes to work. Yesterday, she was seen photographing the coffee shop where you've been conducting surveillance. She knows someone is paying attention to her activities. Marcus felt his chest tighten. If Helena Morrison realized she was under investigation, she might accelerate her timeline for harming Zara. Or worse, she might decide to disappear with the child before anyone could intervene. James, how quickly can we move to get Zara into protective custody? Not quickly enough if Helena panics and does something drastic. We still don't have sufficient evidence for emergency removal, and the legal process could take days, even under the best circumstances. Dr. Chen had been listening to the phone conversation, and now she stepped forward with an expression of absolute determination. Then we need to approach this differently. We need to make contact with Zara directly, establish a relationship. That gives her a safe person to turn to when Helena's abuse escalates. How do we do that without alerting Helena? Marcus asked. Mrs. Rodriguez. She's already established trust with Zara, and Helena doesn't see her as a threat because she appears to be just a kindly volunteer helping children get to school safely. If we can work through Mrs. Rodriguez to give Zara a way to call for help when she needs it. Marcus was already reaching for his phone. Set up a meeting with Mrs. Rodriguez immediately, and James, I want you to prepare emergency custody papers. We can file the moment we have any evidence of immediate danger. But as they made their plans, none of them realized that Helena Morrison's private investigator had already identified Marcus Sterling as the well-dressed man watching the apartment building, and Helena Morrison had just learned that the child she was systematically torturing was under the protection of one of the city's most powerful and wealthy businessmen. The game, as she saw it, had just become infinitely more interesting and dangerous. The meeting with Mrs. Rodriguez took place in a small community center, 3 blocks from Zara's school, chosen specifically because it was far from Helena Morrison's usual routes and surveillance. Marcus had never felt more nervous about a business meeting because he understood that everything depended on convincing this retired teacher to help them save a child's life. Carmen Rodriguez was a woman in her 60s with silver hair, gentle, eyes and hands that showed decades of caring for children. But when she spoke about Zara Thompson, her voice carried a steel that reminded Marcus why good teachers were among society's fiercest protectors. That baby is dying inside, she said without preamble. I've been working with children for 40 years, and I've never seen a spirit being crushed so systematically. Every day when I walk her to school, I can see a little more of her hope disappearing. Dr. Chen leaned forward. Mrs. Rodriguez, we believe Zara is in immediate physical danger from her stepmother. We need your help to establish a safety net for her. Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes sharpened. I suspected as much. That woman, Helena, she comes to school events but never actually watches Zara perform or participate in activities. She signs the papers, pays the fees, but there's no warmth, no maternal connection. It's like she's going through the motions of being a guardian while waiting for something. Marcus pulled out a specially prepared cell phone, a simple device programmed with direct numbers to him, James Morrison, Dr. Chen, and 911. We want to give this to Zara through you. If Helena Morrison tries to hurt her, she'll have a way to call for help immediately. But we need to be careful about how we do this, Dr. Chen added. If Helena discovers Zara has a phone, it could trigger the exact escalation we're trying to prevent. Mrs. Rodriguez studied the phone, then looked up at Marcus with an expression that combined gratitude and determination. This child has been carrying adult burdens for months. She's stronger than people realize, but she's also desperate for someone to care about her survival. I'll find a way to give her this phone safely. There's something else, Marcus said. We've learned about Zara's singing ability. Dr. Chen thinks it might be important for her psychological resilience. Mrs. Rodriguez's face lit up for the first time during their conversation. Oh, that voice. Marcus, when that child sings, it's like watching someone's soul speak directly to God. But she's terrified to let anyone at home know about it. She made me promise never to mention her singing where Helena might hear about it. Why do you think Helena forbids it? Because it's the one thing Helena can't control or destroy, Mrs. Rodriguez said immediately. That woman can contaminate Zara's food, isolate her from friends, make her life miserable in dozens of ways. But when Zara sings, she becomes someone Helena can't touch. It's pure defiance through beauty, and bullies always hate what they can't corrupt. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, not just protective anger, but genuine admiration for a 7-year-old child who'd found a way to resist her tormentor through the power of her extraordinary gift. Zara Thompson wasn't just a victim to be saved. She was a fighter who'd been waging her own battle against Helena Morrison, with the only weapon available to her. Mrs. Rodriguez, would it be possible for you to record Zara singing again? Something we could use to show authorities the psychological state of a child under this kind of stress. I'll ask her. But Marcus, you should know, yesterday something changed. Zara asked me what happens to children when their guardians can't take care of them anymore. She's starting to think about escape, which means Helena's abuse might be reaching a breaking point. The implication sent chills through all three adults. Children Zara's age didn't typically think about alternative living arrangements unless their current situation had become unbearable. If she was considering the possibility that Helena might not always be her guardian, it suggested the abuse had escalated beyond what they'd already documented. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from the private investigator he'd hired to monitor Helena Morrison. The message was brief but alarming. Subject observed purchasing large quantities of cleaning supplies and plastic sheeting, behavior consistent with preparation for evidence disposal. He showed the text to Dr. Chen and Mrs. Rodriguez, watching. Their expressions grow pale as they understood the implications. "We're out of time," Dr. Chen said quietly. "Helena Morrison is preparing for something, and given her history with her previous husbands, we have to assume she's planning to harm Zara very soon." Mrs. Rodriguez stood up abruptly. "Then we move tonight. I'll get the phone to Zara during her walk to school tomorrow morning, and we'll activate whatever legal protections you can arrange immediately afterward." Marcus was already dialing James Morrison's number. "James, I need those emergency custody papers filed first thing tomorrow morning. We're not waiting for perfect evidence anymore." But as they finalized their plans to save Zara Thompson, Helena Morrison was across town meeting with her private investigator, learning everything he'd discovered about Marcus Sterling's wealth, resources, and apparent obsession with her stepdaughter. "So this billionaire thinks he can play hero," Helena said, studying photographs of Marcus taken outside the coffee shop. "How interesting. I wonder what he'd be willing to pay to ensure little Zara doesn't have any more accidents." The private investigator looked uncomfortable. "Ma'am, if you're planning what I think you're planning, I need to withdraw from this case. I investigate people. I don't help with crimes." Helena Morrison smiled, and it was the cold expression of someone who'd already killed 3 people and was looking forward to adding more names to her list. "Don't worry about the crimes," she said softly. "Just make sure Marcus Sterling knows that if he doesn't back off immediately, both he and that precious little girl he's trying to save are going to have unfortunate accidents. Very, very unfortunate accidents." The call came at 3:17 a.m., piercing through Marcus's restless sleep like a siren. Mrs. Rodriguez's voice was tight with panic, words tumbling over each other as she struggled to explain what had happened. "Marcus, she's gone. Helena took Zara in the middle of the night. There are police cars at the apartment building, but they're saying it's not kidnapping because Helena is her legal guardian. They left hours ago and nobody knows where they went." Marcus was already pulling on clothes, his mind racing through contingencies he'd hoped they'd never need to implement. "Mrs. Rodriguez, did you give Zara the phone?" "Yes, yesterday morning, just like we planned. She hid it in her school backpack. But Marcus, if Helena discovered it." The implication hung in the air between them. If Helena Morrison had found the phone, she would know that Zara had outside help, that people were actively working to save her, and a woman who'd already killed 3 people wouldn't hesitate to eliminate a child she saw as both a financial obstacle and a potential witness. Marcus was in his car within 5 minutes, speeding toward the apartment building while calling James Morrison. His attorney answered on the first ring, clearly having been awakened by the same kind of emergency call. "James, Helena Morrison has disappeared with Zara. What are our legal options?" "Practically none, unless we can prove immediate danger. She's the legal guardian, and she can take Zara anywhere she wants within the United States without it being considered kidnapping." "What about the evidence we've gathered? The suspicious deaths of her previous husbands, the psychological abuse, the contaminated food? It's all circumstantial, Marcus. We have theories and patterns, but no direct proof that would satisfy a judge for emergency intervention." Marcus felt desperation clawing at his chest. Somewhere out there, a 7-year-old girl was alone with a woman who'd killed before, and who had millions of reasons to ensure Zara never lived to claim her inheritance. But then his phone rang with a call that changed everything. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but when Marcus answered, he heard the most beautiful sound in the world, Zara Thompson's voice, speaking in a whisper barely audible over what sounded like highway noise. "Hello? Is this the Angel Man? Mrs. Rodriguez told me about..." Marcus pulled over immediately, his hands shaking as he gripped the phone. "Zara? Honey? Where are you?" "I don't know. Helena made me pack my clothes and get in the car in the dark. We've been driving for a long time. She keeps talking on her phone to someone about money and making problems go away." "Zara, are you hurt?" "No, but I'm scared. Helena has been different since yesterday. She keeps looking at me like she's angry about something. And she took my singing away." "What do you mean?" "She found my secret music notebook where I write down songs I make up. She burned it in the kitchen sink and said if she ever heard me make another sound, she'd make sure I never made any sounds again." Marcus felt rage surge through him, but he forced his voice to remain calm and reassuring. "Zara, listen to me very carefully. You are the bravest little girl I've ever known, and you're not alone anymore. There are people who care about you, and we're going to make sure you're safe." "She's coming back to the car," Zara whispered urgently. "We stopped at a gas station, but she told me to stay in the car. I can see her through the window." "Zara, can you tell me what you see around you? Any signs, buildings, anything that might help us find you?" "There's a big sign that says Desert Springs 200 miles, and there are mountains that look purple in the morning light." Marcus's mind immediately began calculating. Desert Springs was a small town on the edge of Nevada, about 4 hours from the city if Helena had been driving through the night. But why would she head toward Nevada unless— the realization hit him like lightning. Nevada had different laws regarding inheritance, different procedures for establishing residency. If Helena Morrison was planning to kill Zara, she might be positioning herself in a jurisdiction where she could more easily claim the inheritance without excessive legal scrutiny. "Zara, I need you to keep this phone hidden and safe. If Helena tries to hurt you or if you get scared, call this number immediately. Can you do that for me?" "Yes, but sir, if something happens to me, will you tell Mrs. Rodriguez that I never stopped singing inside my heart? Even when Helena said I couldn't make sounds anymore, the music was still there. The simple courage in her words nearly broke Marcus's composure. This child, facing unimaginable danger, was more concerned about preserving her artistic spirit than her physical safety. "Zara, you're going to tell Mrs. Rodriguez that yourself, because we're going to bring you home safe. But right now, I need you to hide the phone and be very careful. She's coming back, I have to go." The line went dead, but Marcus was already calling every resource at his disposal. Private investigators, helicopter pilots, security specialists, anyone who could help track a woman driving toward Nevada with a child she intended to kill. Within 30 minutes, Marcus had mobilized a rescue operation that would have impressed military commanders. His helicopter pilot, Jake Rodriguez, Carmen's nephew and a former Marine, was preparing to take off from a private airfield. 2 teams of private security specialists were driving toward Nevada in separate vehicles, equipped with tracking equipment and direct communication links to law enforcement. Dr. Chen joined the helicopter team, bringing specialized equipment for treating traumatized children, while James Morrison remained at Marcus's penthouse, coordinating with legal authorities across multiple jurisdictions. They'd transformed his living room into a command center, with multiple phones, computers, and maps covering every surface. "Marcus, I've got contacts at the Nevada State Police," James called out. "They're aware of the situation and ready to respond the moment we locate Helena Morrison's vehicle." But as dawn broke over the desert landscape below, Marcus stared through the helicopter's windows at the vast expanse of highway stretching endlessly in all directions. Finding one car in this emptiness felt like searching for a single grain of sand on an infinite beach. Then Jake Rodriguez's voice crackled through the helicopter's communication system. "Marcus, we've got something. Nevada Highway Patrol just reported an abandoned vehicle matching Helena Morrison's car description at a truck stop near Whisper Creek. No sign of occupants." Marcus's blood turned to ice. If Helena had abandoned the car, it meant she'd either switched vehicles or— He couldn't finish the thought. "Take us there now," he said. The helicopter banked sharply, racing toward the truck stop at maximum speed. Through his headset, Marcus could hear radio chatter from multiple law enforcement agencies converging on the same location. But what they found when they landed made his heart skip with equal measures of terror and hope. Helena Morrison's car sat empty in the parking lot, driver's door hanging open as if she'd left in a hurry. But there was no sign of either Helena or Zara, and the local police were already treating it as a potential crime scene. "Mr. Sterling," called Sheriff Martinez, the local law enforcement coordinator. "We found something you need to see." Inside, the car on the passenger seat was a piece of notebook paper with a message written in a child's careful handwriting. "I know what you did to my daddy and your other husbands. The Angel Man knows too. If you hurt me, everyone will know you're a killer." Marcus stared at the note, realizing that 7-year-old Zara Thompson had somehow discovered Helena's murderous history and confronted her killer stepmother directly. The courage it must have taken for a child to write those words to someone she knew was planning to harm her was almost incomprehensible. "Sheriff, have you searched the surrounding area?" "We're doing that now, but this is rough country. If someone wanted to hide a—" Sheriff Martinez stopped himself, clearly not wanting to voice what they were all thinking. But then Dr. Chen's voice called from across the parking lot, filled with excitement rather than dread. "Marcus, over here." She was standing near a large, boulder formation about 50 yards from the truck stop, pointing toward what appeared to be tire tracks leading away from the main road. But more importantly, she was holding up Zara's pink backpack. "I found this wedged behind the rocks, like someone hid it deliberately," she called out. "And Marcus, there's something else. Listen." In the desert silence, carried on the morning wind, came the sound that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. It was Zara's voice, singing with pure, transcendent power that seemed to transform the harsh landscape into something beautiful and sacred. The melody was Amazing Grace, but Zara's interpretation gave it layers of meaning that spoke of suffering overcome, of hope maintained against impossible odds, of a spirit that refused to be broken despite every attempt to destroy. Her voice echoed off the rock formations, creating natural harmonies that made the song sound like a choir of angels. Marcus ran toward the sound, followed by Dr. Chen, Sheriff Martinez, and half a dozen law enforcement officers. They found Zara, seated on a flat rock about a quarter-mile from the truck stop, completely alone, singing with her eyes closed and her face turned toward the rising sun. When she saw Marcus approaching, she stopped singing and smiled. Not the careful, fearful expression he'd seen through his telescope, but the radiant joy of a child who'd discovered her own strength. "Hello, Angel Man," she said simply. "I knew you would find me." "Zara, honey, where's Helena?" Marcus asked, kneeling beside her so they were at eye level. "She ran away when I gave her the note. I think she was scared because she finally realized I'm not the broken little girl she thought she was breaking." Zara's voice carried a wisdom that seemed far beyond her 7 years. "I've been listening to her phone calls for months. I know about the other husbands and I know she killed my daddy, but I also know something she doesn't." "What's that, sweetheart?" "She can't kill music, even when she made me eat those terrible things. Even when she burned my notebook, even when she said I couldn't make sounds anymore, the songs were still inside me. And songs don't die, do they, Angel Man?" Marcus felt tears running down his face as he looked at this extraordinary child who'd survived months of systematic abuse, not by becoming broken, but by becoming unbreakable. "No, Zara, songs never die. They just get stronger." Sheriff Martinez approached carefully, speaking in the gentle tone law enforcement officers reserve for vulnerable witnesses. "Zara, can you tell us which direction Helena went when she left you here?" "Toward the big rocks where the road goes up the mountain. But she was walking funny, like her legs were shaky. I think she was scared because she never expected a little kid to figure out what she was doing." Within an hour, Nevada State Police had located Helena Morrison attempting to hitchhike on a mountain road 15 miles from where she'd abandoned Zara. When they arrested her, she was carrying the plastic sheeting and cleaning supplies Marcus's investigator had observed her purchasing, along with detailed plans for disposing of what she'd clearly expected to be Zara's body, but perhaps most damaging to Helena's planned defense was her own recorded confession. Unknown to her, Zara had activated the emergency phone's recording function before writing her confrontation note, capturing Helena's panicked admission of killing David Thompson and her 2 previous husbands. "That little girl is smarter than all of us combined," Sheriff Martinez said as they watched Helena Morrison being loaded into a police transport vehicle. She gathered evidence, confronted her abuser, executed an escape plan, and provided law enforcement with everything we need for prosecution. I've never seen anything like it. 3 months later, Marcus Sterling sat in the front row of Carnegie Hall, watching Zara Thompson perform with the New York Children's Choir in a benefit concert for abused children. She'd been living with Mrs. Rodriguez and her family since Helena Morrison's arrest, her inheritance safely managed in trust by James Morrison until she reached adulthood. But more importantly, Zara was singing again, not just surviving, but thriving with the kind of joy that comes from discovering that love and protection actually exist in the world. Her voice had grown even more powerful, carrying not just technical perfection, but the emotional depth of someone who'd faced darkness and chosen light. As she began her solo performance of Somewhere Over the Rainbow, Marcus closed his eyes and remembered the night he'd first seen her through his telescope, forced to eat contaminated food by a woman who'd wanted to destroy her spirit. The contrast between that broken child and this radiant young artist was so profound it felt like witnessing a miracle. When the concert ended and Zara took her bow to thunderous applause, she looked directly at Marcus and mouthed 2 words: "Thank you." But Marcus knew the truth. He'd thought he was saving her, but Zara Thompson had saved herself, and in the process she'd taught a lonely millionaire that the most valuable treasures in life aren't measured in dollars, but in the courage to care about someone else's happiness more than your own comfort. The little girl who'd been forced to swallow ants had grown up to swallow fear instead, transforming it into music that would inspire thousands of other children to believe that they too could survive anything and emerge even stronger. Helena Morrison was sentenced to life in prison without parole for the murders of 3 husbands and the attempted murder of Zara Thompson. But her victim had already moved far beyond being defined by what Helena had tried to do to her. Zara Thompson had become what Helena Morrison could never destroy, a voice of hope that would ring out across the world, reminding everyone who heard. Her sing that some spirits are simply too powerful to break. The music in her heart had indeed become the sound of freedom, not just her own, but for everyone brave enough to listen and believe that love really can conquer evil, one song at a time. The end. The end.